The sun had barely risen over the desert horizon when the homeowner realized something was wrong. The quiet morning carried an unusual heaviness, the kind that warns you before the trouble even appears. For years, he had lived on the edge of that dusty Arizona neighborhood, far enough from his neighbors to enjoy privacy but close enough to be under the rule of the most notoriously strict HOA in the county. He had gotten used to their petty letters, veiled threats, and late-night rule pamphlets slipped into his mailbox like warnings from a shadowy organization. But nothing the HOA had ever done compared to what was coming that morning. The sound reached him first, a low, rumbling convoy rolling slowly down his gravel road. The vibration shook his windows as if something far larger was approaching, something official, something planned. He stepped out onto his porch and felt the dry heat rising already from the earth, carrying dust across his boots as he scanned the road. It didn't take long to see the first vehicle crest the hill, then another, then another. A white van marked HOA Enforcement Unit led the procession, followed by two black SUVs and a pair of pickup trucks. It looked like a small task force. He wasn't surprised. The HOA had been escalating for months. It started with complaints about non-compliant yard aesthetics and morphed into accusations about property modifications he never made. They wanted control. They wanted submission. And when he didn't bow to their demands, they decided to turn him into an example. But even he didn't expect them to send armed inspectors. As the convoy approached, he could see the inspectors stepping out one by one. They wore tactical vests marked with HOA patches, the kind meant to intimidate rather than serve any real purpose. Their belts carried pepper spray, zip ties, and radios, giving them an appearance far beyond their actual authority. A lawyer stepped out last, holding a thick folder like it was some sacred legal scripture. The homeowner knew exactly what they planned to do. They would attempt to issue violations, demand immediate inspections, and corner him into compliance under the threat of legal action. It was the same tactic they used with other residents, aggressive visits that made people too scared to fight back. But he was not like the others. He had been preparing. Weeks earlier, when the HOA first hinted at mandatory property audits, he started documenting everything. Every letter. Every threat. Every false accusation. He installed cameras not just around his home but along the perimeter of his property. He researched state laws, HOA limitations, and property rights until he knew more than their entire board combined. What the HOA thought was fear was actually strategy. What they believed was defiance was simply patience. So when the HOA convoy finally parked in front of his land, kicking up clouds of dust, he wasn't the one who panicked. The inspectors spread out like they were beginning a military operation. They moved in formation, some heading toward his front yard, others scanning for supposed violations to photograph. The lawyer hung back, flipping through the thick folder while fanning himself from the desert heat. The homeowner watched from his porch, calm and steady, letting them attempt the intimidation they had mastered over the years. But they still didn't know what he had waiting. When they attempted to step onto his property without permission, the first surprise hit them. Every camera he had installed clicked on, activating a loud automated announcement that echoed across the land, "Unauthorized entry detected. This property is under legal surveillance." The inspectors halted mid-stride, startled. They had expected resistance, but not preparation. One of them tried to wave toward the camera, attempting to downplay it as a misunderstanding. But the homeowner stood firm at the top of his steps, watching silently, giving them nothing. They weren't ready for a homeowner who refused to be bullied. The next surprise came when they attempted to conduct their so-called mandatory inspection. The homeowner had already filed legal notices weeks earlier stating that any inspection attempt required written notice and a mutually agreed-upon time. Those notices were now active, stamped, and legally binding. And all of it was documented. The lawyer opened the folder with an air of superiority, only to find a stack of printed email responses the homeowner had already sent, proof that the HOA knew exactly what the rules were. The man had anticipated their move long before they made it. The lawyer's expression shifted from confidence to irritation. The inspectors didn't like that either. They began circling the property, taking photos anyway, desperate to find something to justify their presence. But everything they pointed at, the fence, the yard tools, the porch setup, was entirely legal. The homeowner had made sure of it. Behind him, inside the house, his computer setup recorded the entire confrontation. Every vehicle. Every inspector. Every unauthorized step. The HOA had hoped to corner him, but he was building a case against them instead. Then came the moment that changed everything. One inspector radioed the others and motioned toward the side of the house. It was an area the HOA had complained about multiple times, accusing him of storing dangerous equipment. What they didn't know was that it wasn't dangerous at all, it was simply a locked shed containing tools, fully allowed under the HOA's own rules. But they tried to force it open anyway. The sound of metal rattling echoed across the yard. And that was when the homeowner made his move. He didn't bring aggression. He didn't bring chaos. He simply turned, reached behind the door, and grabbed the one thing that would stop the HOA dead in their tracks, not a weapon, but a bright orange, fully legal, state-issued notice of trespass warning. The HOA had expected a scared resident. They weren't ready for a prepared one. As the desert wind picked up, carrying dust across the scene, the inspectors found themselves at a standstill, caught in a reality they had not planned for. Their entire operation was unraveling, and they had no idea what awaited them next. And as the homeowner stepped off his porch, walking calmly toward the inspectors with evidence in one hand and authority on his side, the HOA realized they had triggered a battle they couldn't control. The real fight was only beginning. The desert sun climbed higher as the homeowner walked toward the group, the heat pressing down on everyone with a growing intensity. The inspectors, who entered the property with confidence and authority, now found themselves uncertain and disorganized. The trespass notice clutched in the homeowner's hand was more than a piece of paper, it was a reminder that their power wasn't as absolute as they believed. It was a boundary they had crossed, and now they were standing on ground where they no longer dictated the rules. The lawyer, who had been fanning himself lazily before, suddenly stood straighter, his expression tightening. He flipped through his folder again, searching for something, anything, that would justify their presence. But the documents inside were nothing more than old complaints, outdated violation claims, and copies of letters that had been legally challenged. Nothing in that folder could override the trespass warning now being held against them. Behind the inspectors, the HOA's white enforcement van sat idling, its engine humming like a nervous animal ready to flee. Dust swirled around its tires as the desert wind picked up, the landscape shifting from quiet irritation to a gritty tension. Each inspector realized that they had stepped into a situation far more complicated than the board had led them to believe. Meanwhile, the cameras around the property continued recording. Every angle, every movement, every uncertain glance was captured in high-definition clarity. The homeowner had spent weeks preparing for a moment like this, not to confront violence, but to expose the HOA's tactics for what they were. And now, the evidence was stacking up faster than the HOA could react. The inspector who had rattled the shed earlier shifted uncomfortably, as if suddenly aware of how wrong that action had been. He glanced at the homeowner, then at his fellow team members, silently acknowledging that they had crossed a line. No one wanted to be the one held responsible for trespassing on private property, especially under surveillance. But the HOA had come too far to turn back without attempting something. The lawyer took a step forward, tightening his grip on the folder, trying to regain the authority they were rapidly losing. He gestured toward one of the inspectors, prompting him to continue the property sweep. The inspector hesitated but began moving again, taking tentative steps along the side of the house. He snapped pictures of perfectly legal structures, attempting to appear confident even though his posture betrayed his doubt. The others followed his lead, spreading out again, but this time their formation was loose and uncertain. Instead of the confident march they had displayed on arrival, they now moved like people walking into unfamiliar territory, unsure of what might happen next. What the inspectors didn't know was that the homeowner had placed small boundary markers around the entire property, barely visible, but legally effective. Each one was recorded with GPS coordinates, time-stamped documentation, and even photographs. If any inspector stepped past a boundary line, the cameras would capture it. If they attempted to force entry into any structure, it would be recorded. If they tampered with anything, there would be evidence. Their operation was dismantling itself in real time. Across the yard, the lead inspector knelt beside a patch of gravel near the driveway, as if searching for a violation that could justify their presence. He sifted through the stones with gloved hands, looking for something to photograph. But there was nothing out of compliance. The HOA's accusations had been fabrications meant to force control, and now that the truth was out in the open, they had nothing to stand on. Still, the HOA didn't give up easily. The lawyer signaled for the group to gather near the front yard, trying to salvage what remained of their mission. They huddled together in a tight circle, whispering among themselves, their faces flushed not just from the heat but from embarrassment and pressure. The operation that began as a show of dominance had transformed into a desperate attempt to avoid humiliation. But humiliation was already setting in. Several neighbors had gathered near the edge of the street, watching the spectacle unfold. Their presence added a new layer of pressure to the HOA team. For years, residents had been scared to challenge the association. The HOA thrived on secrecy and fear. But now, people were witnessing something they had never seen before, someone standing up to the HOA and winning. The inspectors tried to ignore the growing audience, but the weight of their failure pressed down on them like the scorching desert sun. Every neighbor watching was a witness to their conduct, their trespass, their uncertainty. And every camera mounted around the property was capturing it from angles they couldn't escape. The homeowner stood calmly nearby, steady as a monument, his presence alone enough to keep them from attempting anything reckless. He stayed silent, letting them unravel on their own. He understood something the HOA never did: sometimes the most powerful response is restraint. One inspector, flustered and sweating through his tactical vest, attempted to inspect the front porch. But halfway up the steps, he froze. A small sign beside the railing notified him that the area was protected under state property laws, and any unauthorized inspection without consent would be considered a violation. The words were printed clearly, backed by legal statute numbers and citations. The inspector stepped back. Every direction they turned, they were met with obstacles, not dangerous ones, but lawful ones. Not threats, but protections. Not aggression, but preparation. The lawyer finally closed his folder slowly, realizing the truth: the HOA had walked into a legal trap of their own making. They had assumed power they didn't legally possess. They had overplayed their hand. And now they were standing exposed, disorganized, and powerless. But the worst part for them was still coming. The homeowner had not only prepared defensively, he had prepared offensively. Hidden inside his house was a fully documented case file, ready for submission. Evidence of harassment, unlawful attempts at inspection, repeated violations of notification rules, and abuses of authority. Everything the HOA had done over the past year was catalogued neatly inside that file. And today's confrontation? It was the final piece. As the wind picked up again, the inspectors stood in a loose cluster near the van, whispering anxiously. The lawyer rubbed his forehead as he tried to figure out the least humiliating way to retreat without admitting fault. But there was no graceful exit left. They had arrived in force, and now they were leaving embarrassed. The inspector team began drifting back toward the vehicles, their boots dragging in the gravel. The lawyer followed reluctantly, gripping his folder so tightly the edges bent. The homeowner didn't move. He simply watched them, still silent, still calm, still recording. The HOA convoy, once intimidating, now looked like a defeated parade. As the engines started one by one, dust rising behind each vehicle, the homeowner knew this was only the beginning. The HOA would try to strike back, but now he had evidence, witnesses, and leverage. Their failed operation was the turning point. The battle was shifting. And he was ready for the next round. The days following the failed HOA operation passed with a strange quietness. The neighborhood, usually buzzing with rumors and speculation, seemed to hold its breath after witnessing the confrontation. People spoke in whispers, glancing toward the homeowner's property with newfound curiosity. The HOA had always acted untouchable, an organization that operated above its residents, but now the cracks were visible. Their confidence had been shaken, and word about the incident spread faster than dry brush catching fire in the desert wind. Inside his home, the homeowner remained focused. The inspectors had left empty-handed, but their attempt provided the final piece of proof he needed. For months, he had documented every questionable action, every threatening letter, every violation of state property laws committed by the HOA. Now he began assembling the complete case file, a thick, organized record of the association's misconduct. He worked steadily, going through footage from every camera, labeling each moment of unauthorized entry, each attempted inspection, each violation. He printed out timestamps, screenshots, legal statutes, and correspondence. Everything they had done was right there, captured fully and neatly, ready to be presented before a judge. Meanwhile, the HOA board scrambled behind the scenes. They held emergency meetings, sent hurried memos, and argued among themselves. Their once unified front was splintered into frustration and blame. The lawyer assigned to the case made repeated attempts to contact the homeowner, hoping to negotiate quietly and avoid legal escalation. But the homeowner didn't respond. He knew that silence sometimes speaks louder than words. The HOA leadership felt the pressure mounting. Members complained that their dues were being wasted. Others questioned why armed inspectors had been sent out in the first place. The board's reputation, once built on fear, was dissolving. Still, they tried to regain control by filing a lawsuit, accusing the homeowner of obstruction, noncompliance, and creating a hostile environment. It was a desperate move. And it triggered the final phase of the fight. When the court date was set, the homeowner prepared calmly. He didn't need theatrics or intimidation. His evidence was clear, precise, and undeniable. The HOA had stepped outside its authority, and now they were about to be exposed in a public courtroom. On the morning of the hearing, the desert sky hung heavy with early heat as he drove toward the courthouse. The building stood firm against the landscape, a silent monument to law and accountability. He walked through its halls with a steady pace, carrying the organized case file under his arm, every step deliberate and grounded. Inside the courtroom, the environment was formal and sterile, a stark contrast to the dust-coated chaos of his property days earlier. The HOA's lawyer sat at the plaintiff's table, flipping through papers with a nervous energy. Several board members sat behind him, their expressions tense and uncertain. They expected a simple victory, a routine proceeding they could control, until they saw the homeowner enter, calm and prepared, carrying more documentation than their entire team combined. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. The HOA presented their claims first. They argued that the homeowner had refused inspections, disrupted HOA operations, and maintained non-compliant structures. But their statements were hollow, lacking solid evidence. They relied on assumptions, documented complaints without proof, and selective interpretations of the HOA bylaws. Then it was the homeowner's turn. He stepped forward, placing his thick case file on the table. The judge raised an eyebrow at the sheer volume of documentation. He began presenting it methodically, footage of inspectors stepping past boundary markers without permission, timestamps showing they attempted entry without notice, footage of the armed team inspecting areas they had no legal right to inspect, and printed legal notices proving the HOA had been informed of the rules well in advance. He showed the timestamps matching the HOA team rattling the shed, attempting to force entry into a structure without consent. He displayed the camera recordings of their arrival, their aggression, their unauthorized presence. Every moment had been captured, preserved, and now used against them. The courtroom shifted. The HOA's confidence evaporated. Their lawyer flipped through his folders only to realize he had no counter-evidence. The board members behind him exchanged panicked looks. They had walked into this hearing believing they held all the power, only to discover they had been outmaneuvered from the very beginning. The judge reviewed the footage carefully, taking notes, his neutral expression slowly sharpening with disapproval. The law was clear, the HOA had exceeded its authority. They had violated notification requirements. They had trespassed. They had attempted unauthorized inspections. Their actions were not just aggressive, they were unlawful. Then came the moment that sealed their fate. The homeowner presented the documentation of the trespass warning, legally valid and issued well before the HOA operation. The inspectors had entered the property anyway, making their presence not just unauthorized, but a direct legal violation. The judge paused, studying the notice, then turned to the HOA's lawyer with a gaze that needed no explanation. The HOA had not only been wrong, they had been reckless. By the time the homeowner finished presenting his case, the courtroom atmosphere was unmistakable. The power had shifted. The narrative had changed. And the HOA, who once believed they were unbeatable, now sat exposed and defeated. The judge delivered the ruling with firm clarity. The lawsuit filed by the HOA was dismissed in its entirety. Furthermore, the judge ruled that the HOA had violated state property laws, acted outside its authority, and caused unnecessary distress to a resident. As a result, the HOA was ordered to pay fines, cover all court costs, and compensate the homeowner for harassment. The board members sat frozen, their faces pale. The room was silent except for the sound of the judge's gavel striking once, a final sound marking the end of the battle. The homeowner gathered his papers calmly, not with triumph but with quiet pride. He didn't look toward the HOA team as he left, he didn't need to. The outcome spoke for itself. When he stepped outside, the desert sun greeted him warmly. The weight on his shoulders lifted. The fight that had consumed months of his life had finally ended, not with violence, not with fear, but with preparation, patience, and undeniable evidence. The HOA, once feared, was now questioned by everyone in the neighborhood. Residents felt safer, braver, and more aware of their own rights. The homeowner returned to his property later that day, the gravel crunching beneath his wheels as he pulled into his driveway. The cameras around his home stood silent now, no longer recording confrontation but serving as reminders of how one person standing firm can topple an entire system of intimidation. His home, once targeted, now stood as a symbol of resistance. And the HOA? They weren't ready for what he had waiting. They learned that the hard way.